Well, hello there. Greetings to you all at Thanksgiving English Fellowship. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to share with you and to speak to you. My name is Sam Mulberry. I'm a pastor from the UK now, very much based in the States. And I'd like to thank your pastor, Jason, for his warm invitation and for this opportunity to be with you. I wish I could be with you in person. I know it's been a hard season for you as a church, having to be physically apart for so much, but praying that God will be with you as you begin to gather again, I hope. I am going to be speaking to you today on the topic of sexuality and gender. These are both topics, as we know, that are huge in the world today. Lots of people experiencing confusion and pain over these kinds of things. And so our goal really is just to look at what the Bible has to say and to see how Jesus is good news to us in these areas of life, just as he's good news to us in all areas of life. So I want to begin by sharing a little bit about my own story on this. My interest in these questions is not purely kind of academic or theoretical. It's been part of my own experience myself. I was a teenager when I first became aware of having feelings for other men. And at the time I wasn't a believer. And so my plan really was simply to go to university and leave home and act on those feelings and explore them. But I became a Christian just as I was finishing high school, just before I got to university, and before I really had any opportunity to sort of explore those feelings or act on them in any particular way. And I'm so grateful for the Lord's timing in all of that. I became a Christian just as I was turning 18, and I realised as I entered this church for the very first time that Christianity wasn't about God congratulating good people, but it was about God coming to seek and save lost people. And I knew somewhere within me that I was lost. I realised that if God had created me, I didn't know him, that I was supposed to know him, and I realised that was going to be my fault and not his fault. And so if I didn't know my own creator, then I was surely lost. And so as I began to understand the message of Jesus and his death and resurrection for me, I realised this was someone who I could trust. This was someone who I could build my whole life upon, and so became a follower of Jesus. And then obviously wanted to think through what he has to say about sexuality, what that would look like for me as a new disciple of Jesus. So I want to share with you a few passages that can help give us at least some foundational beginnings of how to think about these kinds of issues. There's a lot of complexity, obviously. Everyone's story is going to be slightly different on these things, but I hope these verses will give us at least a good sort of area to start in our thinking about these things. The first passage I'm going to ask us to look at is Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 to 28. And you may well be familiar with this passage. It's part of the Sermon on the Mount, a well-known section of Jesus' teaching. And in this particular part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is taking some of the commandments from the Ten Commandments in the Old Testament, and he's comparing how they've been received with what they really meant. And so we'll often hear Jesus saying in this part of the sermon, we'll often hear him saying, you've heard that it was said, but I say to you. So he's contrasting he has no issue with the commandment itself. He's really contrasting what they've been saying about the commandment with what the commandment was really meant to mean. So this is one example. In Matthew 5 verse 27, Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So Jesus is quoting from the Ten Commandments, famously the commandment prohibiting adultery. That was given in the Ten Commandments back in Exodus. And the point of that commandment was you were to be faithful to your marriage vows. You weren't to cheat on your spouse. You weren't to be romantically involved with someone else's spouse. Marriage was to be upheld and respected by all. So when Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, he's right. They would have heard that. And I'm sure Jesus' listeners, they would have been Jewish men. We understand at this particular point, they would have been able to say to Jesus, yes, we've heard this commandment many times. We've been taught this commandment. And I'm sure the vast majority of those men would have been thinking, Jesus, we've kept this commandment. Many of those men, maybe the vast majority of them, were married. And I'm sure a lot of them would be thinking, I've never been unfaithful. I've never had an affair. I've never done anything like that. So they would be thinking, actually, Jesus, I feel quite good on this commandment. Yep, some of the other commandments, you got me there and fair game. But on this one, I feel like I'm okay. But Jesus then says, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Jesus is saying that adultery is not just a physical act. It's not merely something that takes place in the bedroom. It's actually something that takes place in our hearts. If I can put it this way, it's not just about what we do with our anatomy. It's about what we do with our minds, how we think about someone. It's about what we do with our eyes, how we look at someone. And Jesus is saying adultery is looking at someone with lustful intent. Because doing so is what contradicts God's purposes for us in marriage and human sexuality. In other words, if lustful intent is taking someone else's sexuality and saying that sexuality is there to satisfy my appetites, my desires, my needs, that is going right against how God has designed human sexuality to work. One of the things we see throughout the whole Bible is that sexuality is meant to be within the context of marriage. It's meant to be a form of self-giving, where a husband and a wife are saying through the act of sexual intimacy that they are giving themselves wholeheartedly to one another. And it's a form of self-giving that is meant to denote the giving of the whole self, the whole person. It's meant to be something that is lifelong, that I'm giving myself to you and only to you for as long as we both shall live. And so the idea of looking lustfully at someone goes right against that design, because it's not giving, it's taking. It's not within the context of a whole life promised. It's in the context of you are there to satisfy my needs. And so it goes against how God has designed us to live. It goes against God's design for human sexuality. And Jesus is saying that was the whole purpose of that commandment. The purpose of the commandment against adultery wasn't to give us a chance to prove ourselves. The purpose of that commandment was to show what is actually going on in our hearts. Because actually, as we read what Jesus is saying here, particularly in verse 28, he's showing us what our hearts do. We do have adulterous hearts. Each of us instinctively finds ourselves misusing human sexuality, our own and other people's. So I've heard it put a bit like this, that the purpose of the commandment is to show up what our hearts are like. So it's a bit like if you go to the dentist. When I go to my dentist and have my checkup, one of the things that will always happen is he'll give me a little beaker of some coloured fluid, and I'm to sort of rinse my mouth out in this particular liquid and swill it around my mouth and spit it out. And the purpose is it will then show up the dirt on my teeth. And now, if I know I'm going to the dentist, I make sure to brush my teeth as well as I possibly can. I want to sort of have shiny teeth for the dentist. And so I will always think, I've brushed my teeth really well. I'm not going to have much dirt to show up. But when I take a sip from that beaker and swill it around my mouth and spit it out, and the dentist shows me a mirror and tells me to smile and look in the mirror, and I look at my teeth, and all I can see is the colour. That dye is all through my mouth, because, as the dentist says, there is always far more dirt on your teeth than you're actually seeing.